Good afternoon and welcome. I am Karen Yarhimilo, Dean of Columbia SIPA, Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations and co-founder of the Institute of Global Politics. Thank you for joining us for this IGP Rapid Response webinar. We meet at an extraordinary moment, coming after months of protest inside Iran over domestic grievances and governance, and 9 months after US strikes against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. President Trump launched a coordinated US strikes alongside Israel against senior Iranian leadership and core military infrastructure. This represents one of the most consequential uses of American force in recent decades. The killing of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and other senior officials marks a dramatic escalation. Now, the bombing in Iran and Iran's retaliation through missiles and drone attacks on Israel, US assets in the Gulf, threats to maritime transit, and the activation of regional proxies, including most recently Hezbollah, have pushed the Middle East into a volatile period with hundreds of combatants and civilians killed, including US service members among the casualties. Energy markets have reacted sharply. Shipping routes are under strain, and governments across the region are recalibrating in real time. There is a sharp debate about how to interpret this moment. Some argue that decisive force may restore deterrence, degrade Iran's nuclear and regional capabilities, and potentially open space for significant internal political change. Others warn that leadership decapitation and overt confrontation would only harden the regime, accelerate nuclear weaponization, fracture regional stability, and entangle the United States in a widening conflict and with unpredictable consequences. So to frame today's discussion through a foreign policy lens, let me organize the key issues into 4 analytical buckets. The first, we're going to focus on the strategic objective, escalation dynamics, and the nuclear dimension. What are the political and military goals Washington and Jerusalem are seeking to achieve? Is the objective coercive bargaining, long-term deterrence restoration, regime weakening, or something more ambitious than that? Are US and Israeli war aims fully aligned? And if not, where and when might they diverge? From an escalation perspective, what mechanisms exist, formal and informal, to prevent horizontal spread across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and the Gulf? And critically, what are the implications for Iran's nuclear trajectory? Does this campaign meaningfully degrade nuclear capacity, or does it increase incentives for rapid weaponization? The second bucket of questions will focus on coalition politics and regional alignment. Foreign policy outcomes, as you know, often hinge less on battlefield events than on coalition durability. And here, the Gulf states face acute trade-offs: reliance on US security guarantees, economic exposure to regional instability, prior efforts to hedge through diplomacy with Tehran, and diversification towards China. So can the US-led alignment be sustained if the conflict deepens or energy infrastructure is targeted? Do key actors shape the same threat assessment and time horizon? The third bucket, we're going to look at regime stability and internal Iranian politics. Here, external shocks or even air campaign does not automatically produce regime change. One key variables will be elite cohesion, Revolutionary Guard positioning, succession mechanisms, and the balance between repression and public mobilization. And does this leadership decapitation that we're seeing fragment the system, or does it consolidate hardline control? We are observing the early stages of systemic transformation, some would argue. Others will say we're going to see reassertion of centralized authority under just different siege conditions. So monitoring the signaling from Tehran will be key. Finally, we'll look at domestic authorization, legitimacy, and U.S. grand strategy. What is the constitutional and statutory base for this use of force, and how might congressional dynamics shape its sustainability? And beyond legality, there is the broader question of grand strategy, right? How does this episode affect perception of U.S. credibility, deterrence, and risk tolerance globally? So across all four dimensions lies the structural questions. Are we witnessing a redefinition of escalation norms in the international system? Obviously, the targeting killing of a sitting head of states also alter assumptions about leadership immunity and the boundaries of force, and the precedents set here extend well beyond the Middle East. So a lot to unpack. And the Institute of Global Politics was created precisely for moments like this, where events are moving quickly and the stakes are extraordinarily high. Our role, to be sure, is not to advocate nor to predict with false certainty, but to bring rigorous and nonpartisan analysis and policy experience into the conversation. So this rapid response discussion is the first in a series of conversation at CIPA as this crisis evolved. It's actually the second in recent months. The Center on Global Energy Policy will be hosting a webinar tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. on the energy implications of the conflict. So for more information, please visit the link in the chat. Today's conversation will be moderated by our own Lisa Anderson. She's the Dean Emerita at Columbia SIPA, the James Shotwell Professor Emerita of International Relations, and an IGP-affiliated faculty member. She's also a distinguished scholar of Middle East politics and state formation, as well as a former president of American University in Cairo. Lisa will introduce our outstanding panel of experts. And with that, thank you for joining us. Lisa, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our distinguished panelists. Let me introduce them quickly, and then we will take up the Dean's questions. Jay Johnson served as the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security and previously as General Counsel of the Department of Defense. He brings essential perspective on legal authorities, escalation management, Homeland Security implications, and alliance coordination, and we'll be back to him to ask about those shortly. Norman Rule is a former senior U.S. intelligence official who served as the National Intelligence Manager for Iran. He'll be offering us insight into Tehran's strategic calculus and regional networks. Holly Dagres is the Libitzky Family Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a leading analyst of Iranian domestic politics and society. Nadav Eyal is the IGP Senior Research Scholar, author of Revolt, the Worldwide Uprising Against Globalization, and a senior columnist for Yediot Ahronot, Israel's most widely circulated newspaper. So we've got an interesting group to address questions that will take us weeks to sort out, but we'll start here. So let's start with the strategic objectives. What, in other words, are the political end states or war aims of the US, Israel, and for that matter, Iran? So Nadav, let me start with you. What is the end state that Israel would like to see?
Israel would want to see a regime change in Iran, and Israel is quite clear that beyond degrading the Iranian capabilities, military capabilities, ballistic missile infrastructure mainly, that is more of a threat to Israel as Israel sees it than the nuclear infrastructure still existent in Iran and what Israel perceives to be the military nuclear program or dual-use program. It's about really a regime change. The Israeli Prime Minister has been very open about that, has basically recorded speeches with the AI and Farsi calling for an uprising in Iran. Israeli defense apparatus is very skeptical as to the possibility of this campaign to lead as of itself to an uprising in Iran or a regime change. So there is a difference between the political utterances, Lisa, and between what is actually happening on the ground in terms of what the army is saying. They are saying that there are contacts within factions in Iran made not only by Israel, but also by the United States. And we have just heard the news that President Trump has been speaking with leaders of Kurdish factions, and this was confirmed. And we have just read in the Wall Street Journal that there is a conversation about the possibility, or the White House is open to the possibility of these factions or other factions taking control of Iran. Again, when I speak with experts for Iran within the Israeli apparatus, they're very skeptical as to the possibility to manufacture such a change. A change is upon us anyway with the death of the supreme leader, but the nature of that change and the ability to control that change, this is the question.
Thank you. Secretary Johnson, on the U.S., there seems to be considerable light between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government, or at least the chance of considerable light there, not to say the Trump administration and Congress over time. So what is your assessment now of U.S. war aims, and how consistent are they with Israel's?
That's a very good question. Having been in national security, having been on the National Security Council, having read intelligence briefs on a daily basis, I know what I don't know. I only know what I'm told publicly and what I can glean from educated speculation. And I have to say, I am somewhat perplexed about what U.S. objectives are. President Trump last June reported that Iran's uranium enrichment capability had been obliterated by the strikes last June. We now hear that the objective was to take out their ballistic missile capability, but there's also been an emphasis on the fact that Iran has been the principal sponsor of its principal state sponsor of terrorism around the world. And so it is unclear to me exactly what the objectives are. In 2002, though the case was based on flawed intelligence, President George W. Bush, at least before launching the Iraq War, took his case to the people and to the Congress and to the UN. So we all had a fairly coherent explanation for why we were taking that action in Iraq. He received congressional authorization to do so. It was in a post 9/11 period of anxiety. But in this instance, I think we're all a little perplexed as to why now suddenly this president feels compelled to act to take out the leadership of the Iranian government. What was the emergency? What was the exigency that we faced here? So I hope that the administration will do a much better job, a much clearer job of explaining that to the Congress and the American people.
Okay, thank you. A little ambiguity here, but not a surprise, I suppose. Holly, tell us what, if you will, the war aims of an Iranian government are. Is there anything beyond merely survival at this point?
Well, first, Columbia University, thank you for having me. I would start by saying I think there's a couple of things happening here. First, I think that the Islamic Republic feels that it's dealing with an existential threat. And it's clear to them that, in their view, they've always seen that Israel and the United States have always had a goal of regime change, and they've seen these anti-regime uprisings over the years, including in January, where there was an unprecedented massacre, which actually is the reason why we had assets moved to the region in January to begin with. So I think when we say we're not sure what happened, it initially started with this massacre of arguably tens of thousands of Iranians. The president himself said 32,000. And The group Human Rights Activists in Iran said about 7,000 and with another 10,000 under review. And so they viewed that always that this was the strategic goal. We've heard Iranian officials over the years, and especially during this recent unsuccessful uprising, use the phrase the Syrianization of Iran, which is this view that Western powers and Israel were out to carve up the country or fragment it and turn it into Syria, which is ironic because of course, the IRGC Quds force actually played a key role in suppressing the population during the 2011 Syrian uprising and helped prop up Bashar al-Assad. So they've always had this worry and paranoia, and now it's come home, this reality that regime change, at least with Khamenei, the supreme leader, being taken out. We just had the news this morning about the Assembly of Experts, which helps determine a body of 88 that helps determine who gets to be the next supreme leader. And it's unclear if there were people in the building and if those people were able to survive, and they were actually in the middle of voting for the next supreme leader. And I think the second part of this is that this response we've been seeing from the Islamic Republic attacking its neighbors across much of the region, I think this was part of the strategy that they also wanted to pressure these countries to actually call on the United States to evoke a ceasefire. But it seems from the commentary coming from Arab governments, some of which had not had strong ties with Iran over the years, Saudi Arabia, for instance, had cut ties over the storming of its consulate in Mashhad and in Tehran, and only restarted that in 2023 with a China-backed or brokered deal. So I think that that's clearly backfired on the Islamic Republic because it's only angered these countries and is actually having the opposite response. So they've really miscalculated in this moment.
Okay, thank you. That actually is a good segue into thinking about sort of regional politics, as well as these individual governments have their own war aims, or we're imputing war aims to them. But Norman, let me ask you to start us thinking a little bit about how robust the Iranian links with their regional proxies may be at this point, and what is their historic relationship with the Gulf countries. Holly suggests they've miscalculated. Is that going to last?
Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here with such an august group of friends and brilliant thinkers today. And I think you have three different points to make here. The first is that Iran's diplomacy with the GCC was one of the few successes that have survived recent years. It had established a somewhat productive détente with the GCC. It could rely upon that détente for some sort of international profile that was relatively productive. That has now been shattered. And for a generation, Gulf Arabs will remember that they had taken part in no aggression against Iran, and indeed had provided Iran with multiple fora to make its point in various Doha debates and dialogues. And nonetheless, Iran conducted strikes using Shahed drones that Russia has used against Ukraine, and Iran has now used those same drones against civilian and energy structures in the GCC. That will be part of the Gulf civilian narrative for, say, a generation. That is a catastrophe for Iran. The second thing is that the Quds force in Iran has not gone away. Now, this is the organization that killed hundreds of American troops. So this was at the same time that President Bush 43 could have gone to war against Iran for doing that and chose not to. The organization that was responsible for the destruction of American embassy under Reagan and et cetera. We could have had a war then. President chose not to. I'm not suggesting they should or shouldn't have, but presidents have had opportunities in the past to respond to these issues for different reasons. President Clinton for Khobar didn't choose to do so. And now we have an issue where the Quds force still exists, and will have to rebuild the proxies in the region, much as it had to do after 2003 and 2011, 2012. So the Gulf states are watching a chance for the Quds Force to rebuild Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis and provide it with additional technology, additional drones, sea drones, and land drones. And now we're watching the Quds Force try to reach out to Iraqis and the Hezbollah and the Houthis and to urge them to attack. We have seen some attack by the Iraqis, militias against Erbil. So we've seen some responses there. This will not strategically impact the conflict. And we've seen Hezbollah undertake attacks against Israel. Within Iraq itself, it will have some more impact because there's very little air defenses within Iraq to compete against the Iraqi militias. But again, it won't change our campaign. Within Lebanon itself, the Israelis will move into Lebanon, conduct actions against Hezbollah to degrade their capacity. They've already killed the head of Lebanese Hezbollah intelligence. But again, that will not shape the conflict. So in the end, there will be some response by Iran proxies, but it will not impact the strategic direction of this conflict.
So just a two-word answer. Is this something that Iran did miscalculate, that they expected their Gulf neighbors to be more inclined to be neutral or understand that the Iranians were attacking American and Israeli assets in the region, not those countries?
Not at all. They certainly attempted to use their attacks against structures to cause them to cease support for operations against Iran itself. There's a precedent for this. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iran conducted missile strikes against the El Hafshi neutral zone to compel the Saudis and the Kuwaitis from ceasing their support for Saddam. And there's an echo here. In this case, they had thought that their attacks would compel the Gulf states to push the Trump administration to cease operations against Iran. You can see the harmony with previous policies. It just went in the wrong direction. It was very bad thinking on their part.
Right. Nadav, tell me a little bit about how you think this is going to shape the Abraham Accords and the, development of those relations.
So the Gaza war has basically taken the Abraham Accords and relations and the possibility of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which was seen as a natural development of the Abraham Accords, into crisis. Israel's position in the global public opinion in general, but specifically throughout the Arab world, is very much in distress. And this is one of the reasons that the Saudis themselves have explained that as long as you have this government and as long as there is no more of stability in Gaza, and of course, an Israeli commitment for a two-state solution, something that this government is not ready to supply, there's nothing to talk about. However, what has just happened during this war, and I'm talking specifically about what Norman has just referred to, and also Holly, as to the attacks made by the Islamic Republic towards Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia, that changes things. And it changes things in the sense that if there was an alliance or an idea of a defense architecture, and there was an idea like that, it just got much more stronger as a result of the attacks by the Iranians against the Gulf countries. The Gulf countries were stunned is the word, by the Iranian response, because they saw this way. We were lobbying against this war, telling the Americans don't use the bases here, including Saudi Arabia, and the Iranians attacking the UAE with more projectiles right now than they have attacked or attempted to attack Israel. And just the UAE, which is a much smaller country. So there is a joint interest in that sense. Now, one doesn't need to overplay this hand. There is a joint interest, but it doesn't go all the way. And the question is mainly a tactical question of, for instance, interceptors, oil, prices of oil, and interest, and when you reach effectiveness in that regard. But there is an opportunity, there is an opening here for this alliance to be more robust. We keep on talking, we should be talking about, as the Dean said at the beginning of this, about risks and opportunities. And we shouldn't put too much attachment to either of these elements. Some people in the region, I'm not talking about Israelis, are seeing a lot of opportunity with this change because, again, the regime in Iran is going to be changed. That's already going to happen. And even if it's a reformist leader or something that would not supply the demands of the demonstrators, there could be an avenue there of more regional understanding. And in terms of security, this is the fourth time that the Americans, the Israelis, the Gulf countries are cooperating together with Jordan and other countries in defense against an Iranian attack of sort. In this case, of course, a retaliatory attack after the strike by the US and Israel.
Okay, thank you. I want to get back to sort of domestic politics, regime stability, and actually all of our principal protagonists here. But let's start with Iran. Holly, how does the leadership decapitation, as seems to have happened, fragment the system, consolidate hardline control? To what extent can this kind of regime survive under these circumstances?
I think that's an important question. I should start by saying that up until the attack on the Assembly of Experts, it seemed like a somewhat seamless transition post-Khamenei. Article 111 of the Iranian Constitution was revoked. So basically, it's a three-member body with President Masoud Pezeshkian, Gholam Hossein Mohsenejai, the judiciary chief, and Ali Reza Arafi, a member of the Guardian Council. And they were to assume his duties in the absence of the supreme leader until a new one would be designated. And reportedly, that's what happened this morning. And we still don't know the status of the people that were involved because actually Ali Reza Arafi is also a member of the Assembly of Experts. So I think that this moment today, if it was that this 88-member Assembly of Clerics being taken out, if that's the case, or at least a good chunk of them, I imagine it's going to make succession much more complicated because there's certainly not precedent for that, and there's nothing in the Constitution that explains that. That being said, I mean, there's still members of the clerical establishment still in power. Yes, top leadership was taking out, including the supreme leader, but the military and security apparatus is still there. The security apparatus is still cracking down on people. They're in the streets. They're checking cars. The military is obviously still intact. They're firing ballistic missiles and drones at neighboring countries in Israel. So at this juncture, the system's still in place. And obviously that can change in the days and if not weeks to come. But in this moment, there is still a semblance of the Islamic Republic in power.
Norman, how long do you think they can last?
Well, right now, there's no evidence that the Islamic Republic is control over the country has begun to erode. The Islamic Republic has put the besieged militia on the streets. There is no sign that the opposition, which internally is leaderless, rudderless, has no sign of groups that have taken control of territory or have set themselves up with names of entities. There's no sign that they're taking control, so there's no threat to the regime that's evident at present. I would also say that every individual that is in the government right now was a trusted acolyte of the former supreme leader. So you in essence have a fabric of government that was woven by the previous supreme leader. If that fabric is further degraded by leadership changes and by violence, by the airstrikes in coming days, that could represent an opportunity for further change in the government, which could open up changes down the line for the opposition.
Okay, thank you. Nadav, I'm going to turn to you. Is there any chance that Netanyahu has bitten off more than he can chew as you see this play out over what the American president has called 4 or 5 weeks or longer?
That's a great question, and I think it mainly should resonate as to the American public opinion. If there's any sort of regime change or even a significant change within the regime in Iran, something that will supply the demands of the president, that's good news for Netanyahu. And together with the degrading of the military infrastructure of the Islamic Republic, that would be presented as a win for him. However, there are far-reaching implications as to the support for Israel in the American political sphere. And for instance, in the last 24 hours, there were a lot of reports that rested on public statements made by Secretary of State Rubio and by Speaker Johnson that gave the impression that this war was forced upon the United States, and because Israel told the United States that it's going to go for it anyway, so the US needed to preempt a possible retaliation by the Iranians. So first of all, an hour ago, the president spoke in the White House, was asked directly about that, said, it's not them that forced my hand, I forced their hand. I'm paraphrasing, but he said these words. And he said he used the word lunatics as to the Islamic Republic and explained why it was a national security interest of the United States. But it doesn't really matter, as we know. As we know, that doesn't really matter. What matters is how power is played out and what the polls are going to say towards the midterm elections. And if this would not be seen as a success for the president and for the United States, and if this would somehow degrade the numbers of Republicans toward the midterms, and Israel did lobby for this war, it's just a fact, on the record, it did lobby, unlike with the Iraq war, where the Prime Minister Sharon was very careful not to openly, and I would say not even in closed doors, to lobby for that war, and that's the position of Israel. In this case, Israel did lobby for that war, for this war. And because of that, it's a precarious situation. For Israel, its main strategic asset is not its army, but its alliance with the United States.
Okay, well, that does bring us to the United States. And so, Secretary Johnson, what are the domestic implications of this war for the administration, for Congress, for the rule of law? You pick.
Wow. So first, the security situation. One thing to remember and never forget is terrorist organizations are not conventional armies. And it may well be the case that for every, and we learned this 10, 15 years ago, dealing with Al-Qaeda, ISIS, AQAP, for every terrorist you kill, you may be inspiring two more. And so there are things called terrorist-directed attacks, where there's an effort made to launch a large-scale terrorist attack in the United States or Europe or elsewhere. There are things called terrorist-inspired attacks, where an individual is inspired by something they see on the internet or the like. And then there are the so-called lone wolf attacks, which everyone I'm sure is familiar with. And here in the United States, I think we should be concerned about the latter two at the moment. I don't like to be an alarmist. When I was in office and we had a heightened security situation, I put out statements that did not sound alarmist, but here's, in honest terms, the threat. Here's what your government is doing about it, and here's what you can do. Don't ask, if you see something, say something. And unfortunately, if you go to the current DHS website, you get this. You don't get an NTAS, you don't get a National Threat Advisory, you get a notice that due to the lapse in federal funding, the website will not be actively managed. So the American people cannot look to the Department of Homeland Security to tell us to the extent we need to be worried about any homeland threat in light of what happened over the weekend. I suspect that is falling principally to the FBI right now. And again, I know what I don't know. And so I look to our government to tell us whether we should be concerned here in the homeland about events overseas. In terms of the legal landscape, Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution says that it is the prerogative of Congress, not the president, to declare war. That provision of the Constitution is basically a nullity at this point. The War Powers Resolution is close to being a nullity through congressional inaction over generations. And in the meantime, executive branch lawyers, and I used to be one when I was general counsel of the Defense Department, have issued legal opinions, and this is principally the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel, that say that the president can unilaterally commit the military into hostilities anytime it would serve an important national interest, quote unquote, so long as it does not rise to the level of a war in nature, scope, and duration. That is practically speaking, a limitless test. Anytime the president deems it to be an important national interest, his lawyers say he can go to war, so long as it doesn't rise to the level of a war in nature, scope, and duration, whatever that means. Congress is beginning to reassert its war powers prerogatives. There's going to be a vote soon under the War Powers Resolution to force the president to stop hostilities in Iran to the extent they will continue. The problem with that is, and I don't want to get too deep in the legal weeds, but the problem with that is, in order for a resolution passed by Congress to have legal force and effect, it has to be presented to the president for signature or veto. And the president will almost certainly veto any resolution to force him to stop doing what he is doing. And a veto can only be overridden by a 2/3 vote of Congress, which in this political environment is very unlikely. I would predict that Congress will, by majority vote, pass a resolution under the War Powers Resolution to force the president to stop. He will veto it, and there will not be enough votes to get to a 2/3 override. So that's the legal landscape. It's virtually a limitless unilateral presidential authority to commit the armed forces into hostilities, which is what this president has done.
So over the course of time, as you think about, well, as Nadav said, to some extent, the fortunes of the Israeli government depend on the fortunes of the American government and so forth. Do you have a sense that this represents a sort of constitutional crisis that would be recognized? We're coming up to the midterms, so forth. And I understand you're a lawyer and not a politician, but I'm still sort of interested in how we should begin to understand the implications of this for the United States government.
So it's no more, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but it's no more a constitutional crisis than the last 5 or 6 unilateral presidential actions that were taken without congressional authorization. Executive authority has evolved to the point where Trump's lawyers can plausibly say to him, yes, you have the unilateral authority to go do this in light of OLC precedent. Now, it would be a constitutional crisis, in my judgment, if somehow a court, and courts rarely delve into this kind of space, the war-making space, if a court, in a lawsuit brought by a plaintiff who had standing, ordered the president to stop. Very unlikely, especially this court. But if a court were to order him to stop bombing Iran, and he said, nuts to that, I'm going to keep doing it anyway, that would be a constitutional crisis.
Okay, thank you. I have a different question as we turn to a sort of zooming out again about the globe, and I want to spend a little bit of time. We have a number of questions in the Q&A about sort of the global implications of all of this. But I'm going to put you on the spot again, Secretary Johnson. On a global scale, analysts are observing that, as one Council on Foreign Relations fellow put it, this is the end of arms control. That is to say, the negotiated efforts to control the proliferation of nuclear weapons and so forth and so on. The fact that now twice the United States has suspended ongoing negotiations with Iran in favor of military action. It seemed to me both somewhat alarmist and at the same time fairly plausible to say this is the end of arms control, because who would enter into these sorts of negotiations at this point, given what happened with Iran? Can you tell us a little bit about how you and the United States historically have thought about arms control, and whether this does represent a real rupture in what's been for 70 years, an effort to stay away from World War III?
That's a good question. In the Obama administration, we believed that the most effective arms control, insofar as Iran was concerned, was the agreement that we reached, which at least for a time appeared to work, at least for a time. This president's style of negotiation is, if I can't reach a deal, I'll just kill you. And I suspect he hopes and believes that somehow taking out the leadership of Iran will return Iran as a government to the bargaining table. I'm not quite sure if that's going to happen. That may be a massive miscalculation in terms of the political and popular mood in Iran right now. Sort of an imperialistic attitude: do what I say, or I'll kill you. And after I kill you, you'll come back to the bargaining table. That's an unprecedented calculus in my view. And so I think on a broader scale, other nations are looking at this situation and wondering what's next for them. We're truly in uncharted territory in terms of U.S. policy in terms of global power.
I think that's probably true. Nadav, you've written about, as you called it, the uprising against globalization. Tell us a little bit about what you think the world is thinking about this. Clearly we have our protagonists and we have the region and so forth and so on, but how is the world thinking about this?
So this is definitely not extremely popular around the world, but I think that there are different colors there in the international arena. And for instance, European countries have tended to be, specifically, for instance, during the Obama administration time, they have been especially vocal against the Iranian regime because they see this as a threat, because these ballistic missiles can actually reach or are developed to reach Europe. And we have just seen the Islamic Republic try to hit the British army base in Cyprus, actually attacking the EU in the first time in history, and the British sending their own reinforcements there. And that is substantial. But the elevator pitch here is you need to look at this in a global setting. And here's how. Iran is supplying formally 11% of the oil that actually China is using. But it's just formally. It's actually much more than that, because much of the Iranian oil is being rebranded by other countries in the Gulf. So it's about 1/5 of the oil that flows into China comes from Iran. That's substantial. If indeed there is a better regime in Iran, I don't think anyone should speak about a liberal democracy as of yet, but a better regime in Iran, that would mean that from the shores of the Mediterranean all the way to the border of Afghanistan and Taliban rule, you have a dominance of the US American power for the first time in history. And that's substantial tackling China. That is substantial talking about Taiwan and Japan and all the rest. And I think maybe Norman could speak more about how do you actually go through that. I read a report in the New York Times that the CIA was producing all kinds of scenarios into Iran. And one of the interesting scenarios that the New York Times argued that was captured by the Trump officials was the possibility of sort of an IRGC general taking control of the country. And I wonder from a CIA perspective of dozens of years, how plausible is that? Also knowing the history of 1953 and others.
Norman, you can answer that.
Well, it's obviously something that many people have predicted. The Revolutionary Guard is in charge of the guns. It's in charge of the security of the country. It's something that controls a large portion of the economy. It's an easy thing to predict that they're already in charge of most of the enterprise already. So why wouldn't they be the dominant actor that would take charge in any case? And many of the leaders around the table have an IRGC background in any case. So that's entirely likely and probable, and they would seek to stabilize the situation in time of chaos. If I may, could I return to the previous question of globalization for a moment? Sure. Because for regional actors, globalization has a different perspective. And truth in lending, I was the intelligence advisor on the JCPOA talks from beginning to end. I'm rigidly nonpartisan. But the Gulf states had a slightly different view. They were not excited about JCPOA. And their view was they were not kept informed. The Israelis were not happy about JCPOA. Their view was that Europe and the United States focused on a nuclear deal, provided substantial sanctions relief. That relief they thought would be used for missiles and for regional proxies. It was vastly used for other purposes, but it was known to everyone involved, to include all policymakers at the time, that a small but meaningful portion would inevitably, as all budgets are, it's fungible, be used for missiles and the Quds Force for other purposes. Truth in lending, how did that work out with the Houthis and Hamas? I mean, you can't avoid it, but the alternative was a war. You policymakers make their choices. And Prince Faisal bin Farhan, the Saudi foreign minister, was recently asked in Munich about the globalization changes. And he said, look, what is happening now is something that we're talking about may have already occurred years before, where our interests weren't necessarily being taken into consideration by Europe at the time. And now we're just talking about it more openly. I'm not putting a value judgment on either side. I'm just saying that there are different perspectives as to how this issue can be approached.
Thank you. I have a set of questions about sort of China and energy and so forth that I hope we can come to. But first, I want to ask you all about your sense. There's discussion among American military figures and their discussion of American military capabilities and therefore Israeli military capabilities, and to some extent Iran as well, that if this lasts for a very long time, we're all going to run out of bullets, as it were, that there are limits to what the Americans have. They've already used a lot of their munitions in other kinds of engagements in Yemen and so forth and so on. To what extent do we need to be taking that seriously? Or are these mostly efforts to ensure that the budgets are adequate to the interests of the defense establishment? So maybe I can start with you, Nadav. How do you assess this discussion about we're going to run out of certain kinds of military equipment?
So interceptors are hard to produce compared with ballistic missiles, and they're much more expensive. This is the basic paradox there. And in that regard, the solution that was found by the United States and by Israel towards this war and planning of this war, which has been in the planning for weeks or if not months, is to try and hunt down the launchers and the inventories of ballistic missiles in Iran. The belief within security circles involved with this war is that in a matter of less than 48 hours, there will be a substantial degradation of the ability of the Iranians to shoot missiles, to the extent that the Israelis are speaking about opening the Ben Gurion airport, I think, tomorrow. And if I can give a number to that, which I don't think was published, they are left with much less than 100 launchers in the entire Islamic Republic, probably a few dozens. This is the assessment now, I think, not only in Jerusalem, but also in Washington, D.C.
Holly, do you have a sense of how quickly the Iranian military capability would be degraded, and what would this regime or a Revolutionary Guard's version of this regime do if they actually felt that they had lost the capacity to respond?
I'm not a military expert, but I'll talk a bit about defections. I think for a while, there's been this expectation every time there's been an anti-regime uprising that there would be defections, and defections can mean different things. It can mean feigning illness, not going to work, pretending to shoot when you're crushing protests. And so, I mean, I'd be curious, and this is uncharted territory at this juncture, but some of these security forces or members of the military, they're not all ideological. Some are in it because it pays the bills. And we've always wondered what would happen if, and especially now in the past year or so, with the economy doing so bad, are they able to even pay these individuals? And we really haven't seen this fracturing of security or the military apparatus. But if these bullets, as you put it, were to run out, it'd be interesting to see how that response would be. Would they actually technically lay down their arms and defect and decide they're not going to do this anymore? And I think that's probably going to be a mixed bag just because of the ideological aspect. But again, it's really hard to say at this moment.
Norman, any thoughts on that?
Yes, Nadav is correct if you're speaking about the missiles themselves. We're going to see that the next 48 to 72 hours, and that's going to resolve much of the interceptor question. The Shahed question is going to be much more complicated. Now, that's not an interceptor issue. That's going to be something we address with aircraft and other issues. The broader question is how we handle the Strait of Hormuz, which is something that must be handled for the global economy in the near term, and that's going to be what do we do with the missiles on the Iranian west coast. So that's a different type of a challenge. So I think it's not so much we're running out of something, but how we take upon different military challenges. But we're not really running out of capacity. We just have different problem sets to deal with. But in the near term, I think the United States and its partners have what they need to prosecute this conflict.
Okay, let me turn to some of the questions that are here. And maybe Secretary Johnson, you can talk a little bit about how you think two things may affect the prosecution of this war. One, the sort of energy markets world, people obviously being concerned about the availability of energy through the Straits of Hormuz, and particularly China, and what kind of role can we expect China to play, if any, in trying to bring this to an end or to supporting one or another of the protagonists?
Well, the Straits of Hormuz, it's obviously an energy choke point. Our president says this is all going to be over in 4 weeks. The way he envisions this, he's decapitated the Iranian leadership, and it's now up to the people to take back their country. No boots on the ground. And it's interesting, as you were talking about the possible depletion of missiles and military assets, I was looking at the stock price of our major defense contractors. There's been no dramatic uptick in the stock price. I would assume, and I'm not an intelligence expert, I'm not a China expert, that China will largely stay out of this, remain neutral, and watch how things play out. I know that President Trump does not believe in protracted wars. He does not believe in endless wars. He criticizes them and deplores them. In the way he sees this, This will all be over in a matter of weeks, but even if it's not, he will say that it is. So that's the dynamic.
Nadav, if the Americans decide are going to declare victory for whatever reason, what impact would that have in Israeli calculus of continuing to pursue an effort to degrade and destroy the Islamic Republic?
I want to be completely clear about that. Israel would have never gone to the June war in 2025 without a green light from the United States. And Israel would have not gone to this war without the United States either green lighting it or in this case, even joining it to begin with, just because of effectiveness. So to the question, if the president wakes up tomorrow morning and decides that this war is over, whatever the reason is. By the way, if you just look at the goals that were set by the president, you just need to listen to what he said. You can already say that most of these goals have to some extent been achieved, most of them. You can argue that. I'm not sure that that's true, but you can make a calculated argument as to that. If the president decides tomorrow morning that the war has ended, the only thing that the Israelis are going to do is say, thank you very much, Mr. President. They have no alternative. Israel is flying American aircrafts, using American ammunition, is completely dependent on the international defense or advocacy of the United States. And therefore, and right now, of course, President Trump is not only more popular than the Israeli prime minister in Israel, he's probably more popular than God. So the Israelis are just going to do whatever Washington decides. And also, I think that to a certain degree, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who knows his way in American politics, understands that this needs to be played well for the president in terms of internal politics, or it will jeopardize Israel's situation, which is already in crisis with young voters in the United States.
Let me ask you about, we have a question actually that refers to SIPA and SIPA alumni, and there are SIPA alumni all over the region. And so I'm not going to pick out a particular category of them, but it does raise the extent to which we as a school are pretty implicated in all of this. And we're obviously concerned about our colleagues and graduates. But the second part of that question is really about Lebanon and what, Nadav, I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to ask Norman to tell us a little bit about what kind of involvement Lebanon may have in this war, particularly. I mean, obviously, Jordan has been involved and it's, regionalized in many important ways, but Lebanon has always been particularly important to both Iran and Israel.
Yeah. So Lebanon is an incredible story. If someone is looking for a strategic change in the region that is already happening, it's happening right now in Lebanon. What happened is that Hezbollah has decided to join the war. It's a very natural decision for Hezbollah. Hezbollah is an Iranian-founded and funded militia that is very much grassroots supported by the Shia population in parts of Lebanon, many southern Lebanon. But it decided to join the war. It's already in distress politically. It's under siege politically by the majority of Lebanese that don't want Hezbollah to function as an independent militia of the sort that has taken Lebanon to war, for instance, 2006. And now there is a consensus within this Lebanese political sphere, including some Shia minorities, including people like Nabi Berri, the Speaker of the Lebanese parliament, who's been the envoy of Hezbollah. And they're saying enough. Hezbollah is illegal, just because they do not want to be sunk again to a war with Israel that is attacking in Beirut, maybe as we speak. So that could be actually, if someone is looking for a real change of power, this might be happening not in Iran right now, but actually in Lebanon. Of course, very adverse effect on Iranian influence throughout the region, because Lebanon was for many years held by the Iranians through Hezbollah.
Norman, any thoughts on Lebanon, Yemen, other places where Iran has had influence in the past?
We've seen Mr. Larijani pay several visits to Lebanon. We've seen the Iranians attempt to rebuild their political relationships with Hezbollah, and the Lebanese government rebuffed that attempt. It's been a good demonstration of the Lebanese government try to reassert its independence against Iran. And the Quds Forces needs to do what it can to rebuild Hezbollah, and Hezbollah would like that. I think the Israeli government will have no problems defending itself against Hezbollah. Hezbollah will make some efforts to conduct violence against and lethal action against Iran. It will have Israel. It will have no impact on the strategic course of this campaign, and Israel will be able to handle it. But we will likely see Israel move into southern Lebanon to improve its defensive position, and that may complicate Israeli-Lebanese relationships.
Okay, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. There are lots and lots of interesting questions in the Q&A, and so I am going to propose to the Dean that we all reconvene in a couple of weeks, take up those questions, and see what has happened in the interim. But in the meantime, very grateful to all of you for your insight, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much.